He flew into restricted airspace knowing he might never fly out. Lieutenant Callum Reese didn't disobey orders for glory. He did it because a whisper in a war zone led to something no one was supposed to see. A hidden black site, children in cages, and a truth powerful enough to shatter governments. Moments later, 3 MiG-29s locked onto his jet, and he dove into a canyon with no exit. What happened next sparked a global reckoning. This isn't just a rescue story. It's the origin of a myth they still whisper today. Red Kite lives. The first time Lieutenant Callum Reese saw the mountains of northern Pakistan rise from the desert haze, he thought he was flying into the edge of the world. Gray teeth of stone jutted from the earth, like ancient gods frozen mid-roar, their summits frosted in early snow. The sun glinted off his cockpit canopy, a flash of gold in an otherwise metallic sky. He banked slightly left, his fingers brushing the stick with the kind of feather-light touch only the most seasoned pilots developed. Below him, silence. No radar pings, no chatter, just static and wind. And yet, he knew he wasn't alone. He'd flown into unauthorized airspace, not out of malice or arrogance, but out of desperation. They were 12 minutes behind him. The 3 Russian-built MiG-29s that had scrambled from an unmarked airbase south of the border had orders to bring him down. He didn't know that for sure, but he'd read enough flight patterns in his time to know what an intercept looked like. "Reese, this is command. You're deep in the red zone. Confirm your location." The voice crackled in his ear, clipped and tense. Command didn't sound angry, they sounded afraid. Callum toggled his mic. "I've got a visual on a black site. Coordinates 34.0921 by 735134. Hostiles inbound, requesting permission to remain on course." There was a long pause, too long. Then, "Negative. You are to return immediately. That's an order, Lieutenant." He looked down again at the dusty ridgeline. It was there. Hidden among the shadows of a canyon, barely visible except from the precise angle he was flying, was the target. An unlisted facility with 0 IFF signature and heat signatures that didn't match any local infrastructure. Not a power plant, not a comms tower, not a refugee site. Something else. Something they weren't supposed to know about. "I can't do that, Command," he said, his voice calm. "There are civilians down there. Women. Kids. Looks like they're being moved. There's a convoy. No flags, no insignia. Something's wrong." "Lieutenant," but he cut the channel. He knew what would happen next, not just from Command, but from the MiGs closing in behind him, flanking him in a slow but deliberate pincer. They were out for blood, or at the very least, to make a point. Callum hadn't always been the kind of man who disobeyed orders. He'd graduated second in his class at the Air Force Academy, earned his wings in less than a year, decorated twice for reconnaissance under fire, known for being cool-headed, strategic, and most importantly, obedient. But that changed on October 9th, 2025. That morning had started like any other. He'd woken up at 0400, gone for a run along the chain-link fence of Bagram Airfield, nodded at the guards who didn't bother saluting anymore. He was a regular, a lifer, the kind of guy you didn't question because he didn't rock the boat. But there'd been a woman, a translator named Azra. Her brother, a journalist, had disappeared 2 weeks earlier while investigating a cluster of unmarked drone strikes outside Abbottabad. She'd come to him in the mess hall, eyes ringed with fatigue. "They say it was an accident," she whispered. "But there's no debris, no wreckage, just silence." At first, Callum had brushed it off. Civilians disappeared all the time in war zones, especially journalists who poked their noses where governments didn't want them. But later that day, a drone feed he wasn't supposed to see showed a convoy of prisoners being transported under cover of night, through the exact coordinates Asra had given him. So he'd done what no sane man should have done, launched without clearance, took the risk, entered airspace marked as "Do Not Enter." Not for glory, not for medals, for answers. And now he was seconds from being shot down by a nation that didn't even officially admit having jets in that sector. The first MiG appeared on his 6, silent as a ghost, a shadow barely visible against the backdrop of the setting sun. The others fanned out, forming a triangle around him. This was the part where most men would eject or flee. Callum didn't do either. Instead, he tilted his nose down, descending rapidly toward the canyon. His altitude dropped from 15,000 feet to 8,000 in under 10 seconds. His blood rushed to his head. G-forces pounded his ribs. His vision tunneled, but he kept his eyes locked on the compound, and then he saw it. A flag. Not Pakistani, not Russian, but one he recognized all too well. An old, tattered CIA operations banner, the kind used back in 2003 during black site operations. Only this one had been slashed in half, graffitied with strange symbols. Rebel factions? Mercenaries? None of it made sense. Then the radio crackled again, this time in a voice that didn't belong to his command. "Unidentified aircraft, you are in violation of sovereign airspace. Divert immediately, or you will be engaged." It wasn't in English, but Callum understood enough of the Pashto dialect to get the meaning. He clicked the comm twice, a universal sign for message received. But he kept flying. The MiGs descended with him. What happened next would become the stuff of aviation folklore. Something told in whispers at flight schools, passed around in military bars, cited in textbooks as both a miracle and a cautionary tale. Callum dove straight into the canyon, flying barely 20 feet above the jagged stone, using the terrain to break radar lock. One of the MiGs, not as agile, clipped a rock outcropping and spun out in a blaze of fire, its pilot ejecting too late. The second MiG followed, trying to outmaneuver him, but Callum had flown this kind of terrain before. He weaved through the gulch like a bird in a storm, skimming ridge lines and ducking under natural arches. The third MiG hung back. Smart. Callum was nearly within visual range of the compound when something strange happened. His radar went dead, not jammed. Dead, like someone had flipped a switch. Then his heads-up display flickered, and his engine sputtered. "Not now," he muttered. Tapping the side panel, the cockpit lights dimmed, and the control systems began to reboot. EMP. It hit him all at once. The black site had an active electromagnetic pulse defense, not strong enough to knock out a whole airbase, but enough to scramble a lone fighter jet flying too close. He was going down, but he didn't panic. He leveled the nose, flared the wings, and aimed for the one flat surface in the whole canyon, a dried-out riverbed lined with stones and barely 50 yards wide. The landing was rough. His right wing clipped a boulder. The landing gear snapped. Sparks flew. His body jerked forward against the harness. Pain spiked through his neck. But he survived. He sat there in the wreckage, breathing hard, the smell of burning metal thick in the air. And then he saw them. Figures emerging from the compound. Not soldiers, children. Half a dozen at first, then more. Dirty, thin, wearing mismatched clothes, followed by women. And then a man, hooded, his hands bound. The last face Callum saw before everything went black was Asra's, standing at the front of the group, holding a pistol she'd clearly taken from someone else. She was the one who found him, and in that moment, he understood everything. This wasn't about a journalist. This was about a rescue, a rebellion, and he had just become its unwilling hero. When Callum woke up, it was dark, not the absence of light kind of dark, but the kind that carried weight, like the inside of a cave where sound died and breath echoed. The air was damp and smelled of rust, oil, and old stone. His head throbbed. Blood trickled from a cut near his temple. His left boot was gone. For a second he couldn't move. Then a voice. "You're lucky. That wing should have sliced you in half." Female, low, measured. Asra. He blinked against the gloom until her face came into focus. Her scarf was gone, her hair tied back, forehead streaked with dirt and sweat. A small pistol sat beside her on the floor. It wasn't American issue. "You landed on a mine trail," she said. "We thought the MiGs got you." "They nearly did," he croaked. "You shouldn't be here." He tried to sit up. Pain screamed down his spine, but he gritted his teeth and managed to lean on one elbow. "You called me?" "No. I asked you to listen, not to do something suicidal." Callum looked around. They were inside a tunnel, rough-hewn stone reinforced with steel. Old Soviet infrastructure, maybe, repurposed for something darker. He heard faint voices, children crying, soft footsteps above. "What is this place?" Azra hesitated. Then, "It used to be a Russian listening post. Now it's something else. A lab, a prison. Depends on the week. They bring people here, then move them out in pieces. No one comes back." He exhaled slowly. "That man you said was your brother?" "He's here, or he was. They moved him 3 days ago. He uncovered something he wasn't supposed to, thought he could make it public. They made him disappear." She looked at him then, really looked. "Why did you come, Callum?" "I saw the feed, the convoy. I knew what it meant. Most wouldn't risk it." "I'm not most." She almost smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Then the smile vanished altogether. "We don't have time. The strike team will return when they realize the EMP didn't finish you off. We need to move before they bring reinforcements." Callum pushed himself to his feet. His left ankle protested, but he ignored it. "How many people here?" 36, half are kids. They were going to move them tomorrow." "To where?" She looked away. "You don't want to know?" He believed her. He limped after her, down the tunnel, deeper into the compound. It was a maze. Doors without handles, flickering lights, cracked floors. Surveillance cameras had been smashed. The power was low. Whatever organization had run this place had pulled out fast, or something had gone wrong. He passed cages, actual cages. Some were empty. Others held the evidence of their occupants, blankets, bowls, children's drawings scrawled in charcoal on the walls. It made his stomach turn. "This was never about weapons," he said. "No," Azra replied. "It's about leverage, information, biological samples, ransom, whatever they can trade on the black market." "You said they. Who are they?" Her jaw clenched. "Private contractors, former government assets, off-the-books deals. No flags, no names, just profit." He nodded grimly. They emerged into a larger chamber where the rest of the group waited. Huddled figures, mothers holding babies, children too afraid to cry. A few older men, gaunt and silent. One of them stepped forward, a local with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that burned with quiet anger. "This him?" the man asked. Azra nodded. "He's injured." "He flew here for us." That seemed to impress him. The man nodded once. "Then he leads." "I don't lead anything," Callum said. "I can barely stand." "But you know the skies," the man said. "You know how they think. That's more than any of us." Callum looked around the chamber. They had maybe 3 rifles between them, 2 sat phones that might still work, and less than a day's worth of food. No air cover, no evac route. He did what every pilot was trained to do when surrounded. He started planning. The only way out wasn't up, not yet. The surface was being watched, and the EMP grid would fry any electronics within 1,000 yards. That meant no GPS, no drone recon, and no comms. They had to go underground. The Soviet tunnels extended into the foothills, abandoned but partially mapped in old military files. Azra had access to a few of them, stolen documents, half translated. Enough to know that one tunnel emerged 3 miles east, near a dried river basin where an old Afghan outpost had once stood. If they could reach it, they could signal a pickup, maybe even a NATO drone patrol. It wasn't a great plan, but it was a plan. They moved at night. Callum helped the wounded, carried a boy who couldn't walk more than 10 feet without collapsing. Every sound felt too loud, every light too bright. He checked the air every 5 minutes, straining for the whine of engines, the low hum of approaching death. On the second night, they hit a cave-in. A portion of the tunnel had collapsed. Rocks the size of small cars blocked their path. Panic rippled through the group. One of the mothers sobbed. Another tried to dig with her bare hands. Callum stepped forward. "There's another way," he said, pointing to a shaft he'd seen in the side wall. "An emergency maintenance vent. It's tight, but it connects." "You're sure?" the bearded man asked. "No," Callum replied, "but we don't have a choice." It took them 3 hours to clear the shaft, 2 more to squeeze through. They lost a boy to a hidden gas pocket. He collapsed mid-crawl, his lungs seizing. Callum dragged him out, performed CPR, got him breathing again. Barely. When they emerged into the open air, the sky was beginning to lighten. And then they heard it. The rotors, not American, not rescue. Blackhawks, 2 of them. Painted matte, unmarked, coming from the direction of the compound. "They know we're gone," Azra said. "Correction," Callum murmured. "They know I'm gone." They had 10 minutes, maybe less, before the helo spotted them. The boy he carried stirred. "You're going to fly us out?" Callum didn't answer. He didn't have a jet. He barely had a radio. But then, through the morning haze, he saw something. A glint of silver. An old weather balloon tower, the kind used during the Cold War for meteorological readings. Still wired, still functional. He turned to Azra. "How good are you at hot wiring Soviet tech?" She blinked. "You serious? You want to live?" She nodded. Together, they climbed the tower, jury-rigged the signal relay, sent out a burst code used in emergency pilot retrieval, a code no longer standard, but still buried in older NATO databases. 3 minutes later, a response. Unencrypted. Just one word. Copy. They held off the Blackhawks with small arms, fire, and mirror tricks. Callum used a broken cockpit canopy to reflect sunlight into the rotors of the lead helo, momentarily blinding the pilot. It bought them seconds, enough for the kids to scatter, enough for the signal to trace. And then, from the clouds, a roar. Not a drone, not a local jet, but a C-130. Old, loud, impossible to miss. Painted in the retro scheme of a now-defunct American rescue squadron. Callum stared. He knew that bird. He'd trained in it. "Who the hell?" Azra smiled faintly. "You're not the only one with friends who don't follow orders." The plane banked sharply, deployed flares. The Blackhawks retreated, confused, momentarily disoriented. And then the cargo ramp dropped. A man stood at the edge, gray beard, mirrored shades, laughing into the wind. "You owe me a drink, Callum," he shouted. Callum just grinned. Then he ran. The children boarded first, then the women, then the wounded. Callum was last, limping up the ramp as bullets struck the dirt behind him. Azra helped pull him inside, the doors sealed. The C-130 rose into the sky, fire chasing its shadow, hope filling its hull. And below, the secret compound vanished beneath a missile strike. One final gift from a long-range drone that had locked onto Callum's emergency ping. Officially, the mission never happened. The airspace violation was chalked up to a radar error. The black site was listed as an unconfirmed structure destroyed by a freak geological event. And Callum Reese? He was discharged. Quietly. No fanfare, no medals. But among the few who knew the truth, he became something else. A legend. The C-130 droned westward across a bruised sky, the edges of the clouds glowing orange as the sun dragged its belly across the horizon. Inside, the rescued passengers huddled in silence, half asleep, half afraid to believe they were really free. Callum sat near the ramp, his head leaned back against a crate of medical supplies. His ankle throbbed with each breath, but he didn't mind. Pain meant he was still alive. Across from him, Azra cleaned a young girl's scraped knees with gauze soaked in antiseptic. The child flinched, but didn't cry. She looked at Azra like she was some kind of saint. Callum couldn't blame her. He'd seen bravery in the skies, in the cockpit, in the eyes of men who flew into gunfire with smiles on their faces. But what Azra had done, what she'd risked, was a different kind of courage. She didn't have armor, or rank, or orders. She had purpose. He shifted, wincing. The movement caught the attention of the gray-bearded man who'd greeted him at the ramp. Major Vaughn Greer, retired Air Force, dishonorably discharged, and still the most skilled pilot Callum had ever met. "Didn't think I'd see you again," Greer said, handing over a dented metal flask. Callum took a swig. Whiskey. Harsh and warm. "You're not supposed to be flying," Callum said. Greer grinned. "Neither are you. Fair point. How'd you find me?" Greer pulled a crumpled cigarette from behind his ear and chewed the filter. "I get bored. Keep an ear to the ground. You light up an old Soviet weather tower with a Cold War distress ping, I notice. Figured it was you or a ghost." Callum looked around at the rescued civilians, sleeping now in scattered clusters. "How'd you get that strike authorization?" "I didn't." Callum blinked. Greer shrugged. "That drone? Freelance. Some folks in Langley still owe me favors. I called it in before I even saw your face. Figured whoever was down there wasn't supposed to be breathing." Callum chuckled, an empty, exhausted sound. "You always did have a reckless streak, and you always did play it too safe, until now." Greer leaned forward, dropping his voice. "You understand what you just did, don't you?" Callum met his eyes. "I saved lives." "You did, but you also blew the lid off something a lot bigger. That site wasn't just trafficking people, Reese. They were selling intelligence. Data. Human experimentation logs. There are names on that hard drive you handed off. People who run corporations, who advise presidents. You've kicked a nest of very rich, very powerful hornets." Callum felt the weight of those words settle in his bones. He'd known this wasn't just a humanitarian mission. He'd seen the facility's files, just enough to know it went far deeper than rogue contractors. But hearing it from Greer made it real. "Will they come for me?" Callum asked. "Maybe," Greer said, "but they'll come quiet. Legal threats, denials. They won't risk making you a martyr. Your real problem now is what you choose to do next." Callum didn't answer. Not yet. He looked over at Azra again. She had laid the little girl down gently and now sat staring at her hands, the pistol resting in her lap. "You're going to disappear again, aren't you?" he asked. Greer smirked. "That's the plan. This plane's going to touch down in Jordan, then vanish. You and the kids go with the UN. I go the opposite way." "And me? You're a free agent now, technically a fugitive, if anyone checks the right files." Callum nodded slowly. Freedom. It didn't feel like a reward. It felt like a responsibility. When the C-130 landed, it did so in the middle of a sandstorm. Intentional. Visibility was low, perfect for an unmarked aircraft to slip in and out without questions. A small UN medical team waited, flanked by humanitarian aid workers and one man in a suit who didn't wear a badge but carried himself like someone who'd seen too many cover-ups. Callum stayed in the shadows of the ramp while the others disembarked. Azra passed him, pausing only to place a hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said, "for not turning away." He shook his head. "I didn't do enough." "You did what mattered." Then she was gone. He never saw her board a vehicle, never saw her speak to the UN official. One moment she was there, and the next, just footprints in the sand. Greer didn't wait either. By the time Callum looked back at the plane, it was already rising into the dust, vanishing like a mirage. The man in the suit approached, holding out a folder. "Lieutenant Callum Reese?" Callum didn't respond. The man didn't seem to care. "You're going to want to read this. It's a summary of your unofficial debrief. There's also a cover story. You were grounded due to an oxygen system malfunction and never entered foreign airspace. Any allegations to the contrary will be treated as disinformation." Callum opened the folder. Standard issue lies. He'd seen them before, neatly typed, signed by people who didn't exist. "What happens if I go public?" he asked. The man's smile was thin. "No one will believe you." Callum looked him over. "You believe me." The man's smile didn't waver. "I was ordered not to. And with that, he walked away. The world didn't end. That's what surprised Callum the most. He thought there'd be headlines, investigations, people in handcuffs. But the news cycle rolled on. Another crisis, another scandal, another distraction. The site he'd infiltrated wasn't even mentioned. The people he'd rescued were listed as recovered hostages from a criminal smuggling ring. No word about experiments. No word about U.S. involvement. He stayed quiet for a time. He bounced from city to city, got work flying private planes under aliases. Nothing military, nothing official. His face aged faster than his years. He drank more, slept less, kept his bags packed. And every now and then, a name would cross his screen, a diplomat who died under mysterious circumstances, a contractor arrested for fraud, then released without trial. Pieces of the puzzle shifting behind curtains he couldn't pull back. Until one day, 2 years later, he got a package. No return address. Inside, a photo. A little girl, about 10, smiling in a school uniform. On the back, a single line, handwritten, she says, "Thank you, pilot man." Callum stared at it for a long time. Then, for the first time in months, he smiled. And he knew he hadn't flown into legend. He'd flown into truth. And somehow that was enough. The girl in the photo haunted him. It wasn't fear or guilt. It was something stranger, something heavier. The kind of weight that pressed on you, not because it hurt, but because it meant something. He couldn't forget the way she had clung to Azra's hand that day, her tiny legs struggling to keep pace, her eyes locked on the sky like she didn't believe rescue was real. He couldn't forget the dirt caked in the creases of her fingers, the thin cloth she wore that passed for warmth. And now, 2 years later, she was smiling in a navy blue school blazer, one of those white-collared uniforms worn in safe countries. Her hair was clean, her cheeks full, her smile unmistakable. The message on the back had been brief, but it had opened a door Callum hadn't realized he'd closed. She remembered him, which meant others might too. And if even one of them carried the truth, maybe the silence wasn't so total. He tucked the photo into his wallet and stared out the window of his motel room. It was a forgettable place, just outside of Valencia, Spain. He was flying supply runs now, mostly legal, sometimes not. Nothing military, nothing that mattered, until now. The following week, another envelope arrived. Different handwriting, no return address. Inside, a USB drive, a folded scrap of paper, and a printed image, grainy and low resolution, of a familiar face. Azra. Callum sat down slowly. The note was written in a scrawl that looked rushed. "She's alive. She needs help. They know you were there. They know she helped you. She's being held in Tehran. There's no trial, just a cell. No one's coming, except maybe you." He closed his eyes and breathed once through his nose. There it was again. That same fire in his ribs. Not rage, not even duty. Purpose. He plugged in the USB. It held one video file, time-stamped 4 months earlier. Security footage. No sound. A dark, concrete hallway. A woman in handcuffs being dragged by 2 masked men through a door marked with Iranian characters and the number 72. He watched it 3 times. Then he booked a flight. Callum knew Tehran like a man knows a dream he's had too many times. Familiar in pieces, warped in others. He arrived under a new identity, one of 6 he rotated through. This one had a Russian passport and a limp he didn't actually have. He kept his eyes low, his hair longer, his beard full. He made contact with a man named Davoud, a former pilot-turned-smuggler-turned-informant. "I'm not getting involved," Davoud said the moment they met. "You already are," Callum replied. They sat in the back of a bakery, next to sacks of flour and stacks of empty crates. "You want me to break someone out of Evan prison?" Davoud said, hissing the words like they were acid on his tongue. Callum handed him the photo of Azra. She saved 36 people. One of them was a child who survived because she carried her through an abandoned tunnel for 2 nights with a broken ankle. Davoud stared at the photo. And you? I crashed a jet, lost my career, got her into this mess. Now I get her out. Davoud looked up. You're serious. Callum said nothing. That was all the answer he needed. The first thing Davoud did was find the location. She's not in Evan, he said 3 days later, sliding into the passenger seat of the rusted Land Rover Callum had bought with cash. She's in Black Ward 7. Callum frowned. Never heard of it. You wouldn't. It's not on paper. Not even the guards at Evan talk about it. It's buried under the old city. You don't go there unless you've disappeared. Most people don't come back. How do we get in? Davoud exhaled slowly. We don't. Callum waited. Then Davoud added, Unless we use the sewage system. Sewage? There's a maintenance route that runs along the old industrial sectors used during the Shah's regime, forgotten now, but it still connects under the government detainment blocks. Callum rubbed a hand over his face. How long's the route? About 2 kilometers, mostly flooded. You'll have to crawl the last 300 meters. You mean we? Davoud shook his head. I get you there, but once you go in, you're alone. He entered the tunnel at 2:43 a.m. No weapons, no radio, just a headlamp, a steel crowbar, a map drawn by Davoud's trembling hand, and a promise echoing in his head. He sloshed through thigh-deep water, the stench like rotting metal and mold. Rats skittered across the curved brick walls. Twice he had to stop and pry open rusted iron grates. Once, he nearly slipped into a collapsed side channel and only saved himself by slamming the crowbar into a crumbling pipe and clinging for dear life. Every 30 feet he stopped and listened. Silence. Then drip. Then breathing. Not his own. He turned, his light sweeping the tunnel. Nothing. But something was watching. He moved faster. At 4:01 a.m., he reached the access hatch, just like Davoud said. A small circular door set into the base of a concrete wall, obscured by algae and grime. It took him 15 minutes to pry it open. Inside, a maintenance shaft, narrow and steep. It led straight up into the floor of Black Ward 7. He climbed. At the top, a rusted hatch. He pressed his ear against it. Voices. 2 men, speaking Farsi, one of them laughing. Callum waited, counted to 60, then pressed again. Silence. He pushed. The hatch creaked. Too loud. He froze. Nothing. Then he climbed through. He was in a boiler room. Ancient machines whirred and hissed around him. The floor was concrete, stained with fluids. A single flickering bulb swung above. He pulled the crowbar close and moved quietly through the corridor. Black Ward 7 wasn't just a cell block. It was a ghost house. No cameras, no signs, just doors. Steel. Bolted. No windows. No numbers. Just cold. He found her in the 3rd room, not by chance, by memory. He had memorized the gait of her footsteps, the rhythm, the speed, and when he heard them echo down the corridor, bare feet, limping slightly, 1 step shorter than the other, he knew. He didn't knock. He smashed the lock. She flinched at the noise, retreating into the corner like a shadow. But when she saw him, she didn't cry. She smiled. Late again, pilot. Callum dropped the crowbar and crossed the cell. You're heavier than I remember, he muttered, as he half-carried her into the hall. They don't feed us much. He looked down at her. Bruised, blood on her lip, but her eyes sharp as ever. I'm getting you out. You always say that. This time I mean it. She smiled again, and then they ran. The sirens didn't go off right away. That was the miracle of old infrastructure. No cameras, no automated locks, no AI-activated motion sensors, just metal, muscle, and time. But time was already running out. Callum half-dragged Asra through the dim corridors, their footsteps echoing louder than they should have. Her body was shaking from exhaustion, but she never asked him to stop. Her lips were cracked. One of her wrists was purple with bruising. her right foot dragged slightly, her shoe missing. He remembered the last time he saw her, standing in a beam of sunlight, holding a pistol, calm, in the face of death. Now she was half a ghost, but alive, and fighting. "Left," she whispered. "What?" "The hatch. It's left." He took the turn, found the corridor narrowing. Pipes hung low. The air smelled of rot and electricity. This was it. But someone was waiting. A man, big, beard, fatigues, holding a sidearm. They locked eyes, and he raised the gun. Callum didn't hesitate. He lunged, body slamming the man into the wall. The gun fired once, wild, into the ceiling. Callum grabbed the barrel, twisted, forced the man's arm back until it cracked. The gun clattered to the floor. The man headbutted him. Callum reeled. Azra stepped forward, grabbed the gun, and shot. Once, right in the chest. The man dropped. Silence. She stood there, holding the weapon in two hands, arms trembling. "You okay?" Callum asked. She didn't answer, just nodded, and they kept going. The maintenance hatch was still open, but water was rushing in. The tunnel had begun to flood, part of the aging sewer system collapsing after weeks of rain. They stared down the dark shaft, and then at each other. "You sure about this?" Callum asked. "I crawled through worse." He went first, descending slowly, testing each rung of the old ladder. Rust flaked off beneath his fingers. Below, the water was rising fast. By the time his boots hit the concrete, it was up to his knees. Azra followed slower, her limbs weak, her breathing shallow. He helped her down. The water soaked her prison shirt, but she didn't complain. They turned east, following the path Davoud had mapped. A distant sound rumbled through the tunnel, metal grinding. More sirens now, faint but growing louder. They knew. They were coming. But Callum had something they didn't. Memory. He'd replayed this route 100 times in his mind. "Left here," he muttered. Then, up. They reached a small outflow chamber just as a surge of water came crashing in from behind, nearly sweeping them off their feet. Callum held on to a pipe, clutching Asra with his other arm. "Climb!" he shouted. She coughed, sputtered, reached for the rungs. Together they ascended, soaked and shaking. The hatch at the top was jammed. Callum gritted his teeth and rammed it with his shoulder once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th, it burst open. Fresh air hit him like a punch. They spilled out into the open, onto a grassy ridge overlooking a road. A truck waited 50 meters away. Davoud leaned out of the driver's side window, cigarette between his lips. "Took you long enough," he called. They drove through the desert for 5 hours, switching roads every half hour, making sure no satellite could track them. At dawn, they reached an abandoned farm compound hidden behind a canyon wall. Davoud killed the engine. "You'll stay here," he said. 2 days. Then a contact of mine will get you over the border into Iraq." "What about you?" Callum asked. Davoud lit another cigarette. "I don't do thank yous or rescues. I just drive." Callum nodded. Asra leaned against the wall, eyes closed, breathing steady. She hadn't said much since they escaped. Davoud tossed a bag at Callum's feet. "Clothes, food, a med kit." He turned to leave. "Davoud," Callum said. The man stopped. "I owe you." Davoud shrugged. "You don't owe me anything. Just don't make a habit of this." Then he was gone. The farmhouse was silent except for the wind. Callum cleaned Asra's wounds, wrapped her wrist in gauze, and made her drink 3 glasses of water. She did, wordless. Later, they sat by a fire made from scraps of old furniture. The stars stretched endless above them. "I thought you were dead," she said finally. "You weren't far off." "What happened after the C-130? "I disappeared, lived low, flew cargo runs for cash." "Why?" "Because the alternative was standing in front of a camera and lying about what happened." She was quiet for a moment. "They told me I was a traitor, that I sold secrets, that I'd collaborated with foreign military. You did, he said, grinning. She smiled faintly. You were always reckless. I learned from the best. They sat in silence for a while. Then she said, There's something I never told you. He looked over. She reached into the collar of her shirt and pulled out a chain. At the end, a flash drive. I took it from the black site before we escaped, she said. Didn't know what was on it. Just knew it was important. He leaned closer. It has names, she said. Contracts, locations, proof. His breath caught. She held it out. I don't trust anyone else with it. He stared at it, then took it gently. Are you sure? I was sure the moment I hit it. They left the farmhouse 2 days later. Davoud's contact brought them across the border in a cattle truck. No questions. No names. In Iraq, they boarded a private jet under the guise of aid workers. Callum flew it himself. Destination? Lisbon. Safe house. One last stop. They uploaded the contents of the drive from a secure connection, bouncing through servers across 6 countries. The files were encrypted, but Asra had the key. What unfolded on the screen made Callum's blood run cold. Contracts signed by defense contractors, tech conglomerates, intelligence liaisons, experiments on detainees, test results logged under alphanumeric tags, photos, audio, hidden financial transfers. Proof of everything. They stared at the screen for an hour, neither speaking. Then Asra said, We release it, all of it. Callum nodded. But we do it smart, she added, so it can't be buried. It took them 3 weeks to compile the dossier. They sent it to 50 journalists across the globe, 10 whistleblower foundations, and 2 rival intelligence agencies known for leaking. Then they destroyed every trace of the drive and disappeared again. 2 months later, the world changed. Not overnight, but piece by piece. The story hit the wire first on an independent European news site. Then it spread. The photos, the reports, the names. People denied, then resigned, then vanished. There were arrests, hearings, a few fake suicides, but the truth was out. And among the names listed, buried deep in one of the redacted memos, was a notation. Subject Red Kite breached containment during aerial approach. Pilot ID Reese initiated cascade. Cascade. Callum read that word again and again. Then he closed the file and burned it. The rains in Lisbon came fast, hammering rooftops like war drums, soaking the sidewalks and darkening the alleys. Callum stood on the balcony of a rented 3rd-story flat in Alfama, watching lightning ripple across the black Atlantic like a warning. He hadn't seen Asra in 9 days, not since they sent the files out. They'd agreed to separate just in case someone traced the leak. Her plan was to vanish into the Balkans under another name. His job was to be the ghost they hunted instead, the face they pinned on the exposure, the wrong target, a distraction. She hadn't said goodbye, just gave him a look before she walked out that said, Don't die for nothing. But now, the silence was beginning to feel too heavy, too permanent. A knock at the door jolted him from the dark. He pulled his sidearm, crept forward quietly, barefoot on wooden floorboards. Another knock, louder. 2 short, 1 long. A code. He opened the door. It wasn't Asra. It was a kid, 16 at most, soaked to the bone, wearing a windbreaker with a patch of the Albanian flag. "You're Reese?" the boy asked in perfect English. Callum didn't answer. The boy held out a sealed envelope. "She told me not to say anything else. Just give this to you. And leave." Callum took it. The boy turned and vanished down the stairs, quick and light, like he'd done this before. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. "Stop running. Come home, A." No coordinates, no instructions, but a train ticket was tucked inside. Lisbon to Skopje. One way. He stared at it for a long time. Then he packed a bag. The train took 27 hours. through Spain, through southern France, over the Italian border, across the Balkan spine. He changed cars twice, moved seats, slept with his hand on his weapon. But no one came. At dawn, the city emerged from the mist. Skopje, Macedonia, red-tiled roofs, crumbling Ottoman walls, and far in the distance, the snow-capped shadows of the Shar Mountains. He exited the train station into a wet wind and silence. Then he saw her, across the street, wearing a gray coat and sunglasses. She smiled. He walked without a word. When he reached her, she took his hand. They didn't speak until they were inside the safe house. A flat above a shuttered cafe. Smelled like onions and dust. 2 rooms, 1 mattress on the floor. "Why here?" he asked as he closed the blinds. "Because no one expects ghosts to haunt the same place twice," she said. He looked at her carefully. "Are we safe?" "For now." He sat down, pulled off his boots, ran a hand through his hair. "You disappeared. I needed to watch the fallout." "And?" The world blinked, then kept spinning. She pulled out a small radio, clicked it on, static. Then a voice. "Questions still swirl around the so-called Cascade files, with both governments and corporations denying involvement despite mounting pressure from public watchdog groups." She turned the dial, another channel. "Multiple resignations this week following the latest leaks. Former Intel Tech COO Nadine Crest was subpoenaed late last night after—" Azra turned the radio off. "They're unraveling," she said. Callum exhaled. "But they'll find a way to bury it. Not all of it." He watched her for a moment, then said quietly, "So what now?" She sat beside him, leaned back against the wall. "I don't want to run anymore." He looked at her. "I mean it," she said. "I'm tired. Tired of hiding. Tired of watching other people clean up the messes we survived. There's more we can do." "Like what?" She looked at him, eyes steady. "Build something new? Make them chase us, yes. But make it matter." He wasn't sure what she meant. Not yet. But something in him shifted. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man surviving. He felt like a man living. Over the next 5 months, they built a network. Not a rebellion. Not a movement. Something quieter. Better. They called it Signal 9, named after an outdated NATO distress code. It wasn't flashy, no broadcasts, no political speeches, just a system. Safe houses across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Couriers, encrypted files. A growing trickle of whistleblowers, survivors, defectors, each with their own piece of the puzzle. Signal 9 gave them a voice. And Callum? He became its invisible architect. His face never appeared. His name never dropped. But everyone knew the call sign. Red Kite. In Zurich, an intelligence analyst leaked proof that experimental biometric data harvested in the Afghan black site had been funneled into a private AI firm based in the U.S. In Jakarta, a mother uploaded footage of her teenage son trafficked through a Russian-Afghan pipeline, being rescued by Signal 9 operatives. In Toronto, a former drone pilot released his mission logs, showing training flights had targeted known refugee clusters. Every time a new drop hit, governments denied, then investigated, then folded under pressure. Not all of them, but enough. The cascade hadn't ended. It had only just begun. And through it all, Callum and Azra remained shadows, loyal to the wind. It wasn't until the 3rd year that the legend really started to spread. A podcast in Italy claimed to have traced the original flight path of the man who broke into Pakistani airspace. A retired pilot in New Zealand told a story about a friend who'd crash-landed near a CIA black site and vanished. An old NATO file leaked with 3 redacted lines. Subject entered airspace at 1900 hours. EMP strike confirmed. Recovery not authorized. Comment sections blew up. Pilots shared theories. And slowly one name surfaced again and again. Reese. There were those who thought he was a myth. Others said he'd been killed. But every time a new signal went out, a few still whispered, "Red Kite lives." And if you ever walked through the mountain towns near Skopje on a quiet spring morning, you might have seen a man with gray around the temples standing near the edge of a cliff, watching the clouds, waiting. The old mountain airfield wasn't on any map. It lay tucked between two sheer ridges in southern Kosovo, nothing more than a concrete strip scarred by time and bomb fragments. No tower, no hangar, just wind and echoes. Callum stood at the edge of the cracked runway as a rusted twin-engine Beechcraft rumbled to life behind him. The pilot, a wiry young woman from Georgia named Leka, gave him a thumbs up from the cockpit. She was running an op tonight, exfiltrating a defected communications tech from a Turkish holding camp. It wasn't a large mission, but it mattered. They all did now. He watched her take off, wheels lifting smooth into the cloudless dusk, the plane disappearing over the northern slope like a silver ghost. Then he turned and walked back toward the signal shack. Asra was there, hunched over a map with three others, two former smugglers turned courier runners, and a linguist from Belarus who'd been blacklisted after decrypting classified drone footage that contradicted official government reports. "Laika's clear," Callum said. Asra nodded, not looking up. "ETA in 7 hours. If she gets hit, we lose the entire Beirut chain." "She won't get hit." Asra gave him a quick glance. "You always say that." "And I'm still right." That got a small smile. Callum sat scanning the map. "Where are we on the Bogota files?" "Still uploading. Encrypting each block 5 times. The guy we're helping used to build surveillance AIs. He knows how to break them." Callum rubbed his jaw. "What's his price?" Asra's voice was quiet. "He doesn't want protection. He wants to see the people who used his code in prison." Callum nodded. "That can be arranged." They worked through the night, marking corridors, flagging safe houses, sending decoy drops to throw off digital chasers. Every click on the laptop, every ping of a bouncing signal was another needle in the side of the system that had tried to bury them both. But even rebels get tired. By dawn, the others had crashed on mats and couches. Callum stood in the doorway of the shack, sipping burned coffee. Asra joined him. "You ever think about stopping?" she asked. He didn't answer for a long time, and then, "Yes, but it feels like stopping would mean forgetting, and I can't forget them." "The kids?" "The woman in the cell next to yours. I heard her screaming the night we broke you out. I didn't stop, didn't even look." "You couldn't have." "I still remember her voice." Asra leaned her head against the doorframe. "You carry too much." He looked over. "So do you." "Maybe, but at least now we're carrying something that matters." They stood like that for a while, watching the light creep over the treetops, listening to the low buzz of electricity as their signal antenna pulsed. Then Callum said, "Do you ever wonder how this ends?" Asra's face softened. "I used to think it ended in a grave. A shallow one, unmarked, dug by someone paid not to ask questions. And now? I think maybe it ends with someone else picking up where we leave off." He liked that answer. It didn't promise immortality, just momentum. The next day, they got a message they didn't expect. It came through a backdoor channel embedded in an old tracking cookie from a forgotten NATO drone server. Obsolete code, hidden well. Whoever sent it had been watching for a long time. The message was simple. "We have the names, we have the footage. We need a signal, one clear enough to cut through the noise. Can you give us that?" Attached, one file, encrypted. Callum decrypted it personally. It was a video, 10 minutes long. Footage from inside the black site from the day he flew in. Aerial thermal scans, compound schematics, prisoner transfers, and in the last frame, his jet flaring as it landed in the canyon right before the EMP hit. Someone had been recording the whole thing. He stared at the screen for a long time. Asra joined him, her face pale as she took it in. "They knew," she said. He nodded. "But they didn't stop it." "No," he said. They saved it for leverage. She looked at him. So what do we do? Callum didn't hesitate. We give them the signal. 2 nights later, every major city in Europe saw the same thing. At 9:13 p.m., every digital billboard in Paris, Berlin, Madrid, Oslo, and Rome cut to black. Then a flash of white, a blinking kite icon, and then the footage. The black site, the children, the convoy, the faces of men who had signed the orders, the jet, the EMP burst, and finally the words, "This happened. They denied it. Now you decide." It lasted 90 seconds, long enough to capture, short enough to evade shutdown. The world erupted. Twitter, Telegram, news stations. Some screamed it was propaganda. Others said it was faked. But a handful of people had seen the original documents, verified the metadata, matched the signatures. And once the first arrest was made, the dominoes fell. Not all at once, not cleanly, but fast. Senators lost elections, generals were court-martialed, CEOs were subpoenaed, and behind every headline was the same whisper, "Red Kite." They moved again after that. The shack was too hot. Signal 9 fractured, intentionally, not broken, decentralized, safer that way. Callum and Azra vanished into the borderlands again. No announcements, no final speech, just one last message left behind on a closed network. We are not heroes, we are not myths. We are what happens when silence fails. If you're reading this, it's your turn now. Somewhere a young coder in Kiev opened that file and smiled. Somewhere a journalist in Johannesburg printed it and mailed it to 3 other countries. Somewhere a pilot grounded in Arizona remembered the name Reese and wondered if he was still alive. And somewhere, far from the noise, the headlines, the chaos, Callum stood on a ridge again. Next to him, Asra, wearing a scarf woven by the very children they'd saved. Below them, the valley was quiet. Above them, the sky was wide. "I still think about that canyon," he said. Asra looked at him. "The one you nearly died in? The one I finally woke up in." She smiled. Then a sound, a low rumble. Engines in the distance, not jets, not drones, but something else. Callum narrowed his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he felt no fear, just wind and peace. The winter that followed the signal broadcast was the quietest in years, or maybe it only felt that way because Callum and Azra had stopped chasing fire. They'd gone inland, far from the cities and the nodes and the networks, found a stretch of valley near the borders of Montenegro and Serbia, where the only sounds were goats, wind, and the rustle of pine needles under snow. They rented a crumbling cabin, fixed the windows, rewired the lights, hauled in their own water, lived like ghosts who'd decided to try being human again. For the first few days, neither said much. They cooked in silence, ate in silence, and sat near the fire reading faded paperback novels. But silence between them had never been uncomfortable. It had always been where truth lived. Callum took long walks at dawn. He'd follow the spine of the hills and look out across the broken lands below, places that had once hosted fires, screams, and sirens, and now held only fog and forgotten stones. He didn't miss the war. He didn't even miss the mission. But he still felt the engine in his chest, the throttle never quite idle, the feeling that somewhere someone was still running, still trapped, still waiting. One morning, Azra came out onto the porch carrying a single piece of paper. He turned from the slope, saw her face, and knew something had changed. "What is it?" he asked. She handed it to him. A letter, printed from a burner inbox, addressed not to him, but to her. But it was signed, "To the one who got us out. I know what they're doing next." It was from a name they hadn't heard in almost a year, Malik, a former logistics officer who had once operated deep in the PMC network that funded the black sites. A man they'd rescued on a desert road outside of Kirkuk after someone tried to blow his car off the map. The letter was short. No encryption, no embedded tracking. Because Malik knew better. What it said was enough to set everything in motion again. 2 days later, they were on the move. This time, they didn't send word to Signal 9. Not yet. This mission was personal. Malik had provided coordinates, a shipment, a single cargo manifest that had passed through 3 legitimate shell companies and was now headed into northern Africa. The cargo, not weapons, not medicine, people. They're calling them volunteers now, Malik wrote, but it's the same game. Remote testing, behavioral analysis, drug trials. The names are different. The cages are the same. Callum didn't even pack much. He grabbed his bag, the old crowbar, and the flight goggles he hadn't worn since the canyon. Azra carried the flash drive chain around her neck again. The message was clear. If this was happening again, they wouldn't just expose it. They'd stop it cold. They reached Cairo under storm cover, using names that hadn't existed 6 months ago. An old journalist contact slipped them into the coastal shipping yards where Malik said the transfer would occur. It was all too familiar. Gray crates, uniformed men without insignia, security teams with military posture, but civilian papers. They observed for 48 hours, counted vehicles, logged badge numbers, tapped a line into the communications tent. On the 3rd night, they struck. It was supposed to be small, in and out. Burn the files, sabotage the convoy manifest, trigger the asset release. But then Callum heard it, a voice, high-pitched, thin, crying, coming from inside one of the containers. He and Azra both froze. They hadn't expected actual prisoners on site. He broke the lock, found 5 people inside, eyes wide, shackled. One of them was a woman, barely 30, clutching a photo of her child. Callum met Azra's eyes, the same thought between them. We don't walk away. So they changed the plan. They didn't just sabotage the operation, they broke it wide open, triggered the sirens, fired warning shots, hijacked one of the security transports, and drove like hell across the desert. They made it to the edge of the Red Sea before a drone finally caught their scent. Azra climbed into the back, opened the comms box they'd taken from the convoy, and began broadcasting raw files. Satellite pings, contracts, captured video. No time for Signal 9, no time for encryption. They dumped it all. Callum drove until the tires shredded on jagged stone. Then they ran with the freed captives over dunes and under stars until they saw the lights of a village that hadn't had electricity in a year. They collapsed in the dirt, smiling, bleeding, laughing. Because they'd done it again. And the world, once again, was watching. The Cairo broadcast trended for 3 days straight, longer than any news leak they'd ever triggered. This time, people marched. This time, people named names. And somewhere in a control room, a handler whispered into a headset, "This ghost again, this damn red kite." And the operator on the other end replied, "We lost them, again." Callum and Azra stayed in hiding for another month, just long enough for the storm to settle. Then one night, sitting near a campfire beneath a shattered aqueduct in the Sinai Peninsula, Azra turned to him and said, "Do you think we're done yet?" He thought about it. About the jet, the compound, the child in the school uniform, the hacker in Kyiv, the journalists in hiding, the graves with no names. "No," he said quietly, "not yet." "Then what do we do?" "We keep flying, even without wings, even without orders, even if the skies turned black again. Because flight to them had never meant altitude. It had meant freedom. The first sensation was cold, not sharp, not biting, just the steady, creeping kind that told him he was lying in something damp and metallic. Callum opened his eyes, blinking against the swirl of smoke curling through the wrecked cockpit. Everything smelled like scorched metal and old blood. His hands still gripped the yoke of the jet, though the right half of the console had been sheared off by the emergency landing. Warning lights blinked faintly, pointless, redundant now. The wind howled through a tear in the fuselage, dragging grit and ash into his lungs. He coughed once. Pain rippled through his chest. He was alive. His training kicked in. Checked the body, ribs bruised, ankle twisted, right shoulder seizing with each movement. No bone sticking out, nothing bleeding enough to worry him. The harness had probably saved his spine, though the whiplash would leave a mark. The ejection handle still dangled, untouched. He hadn't needed it. Or maybe he hadn't had time. He reached across and hit the emergency beacon, knowing full well it would do nothing. The EMP pulse had fried the internal electronics. The cockpit was just a coffin now, one with a broken door and no lid. He kicked at the release twice before it gave way, groaning open with a sound of tortured steel. The outside air hit him like a slap, hot, dry, laced with dust, and that peculiar chemical scent that clung to old Soviet ruins and desert blood. He pulled himself free, stumbling into the narrow canyon he'd landed in. The jet lay half submerged in rock and sand, nose buried in a slope of stone. Behind him, black smoke rose like a beacon. The silence was uncanny. No jets overhead, no gunfire, not even birds. But he wasn't alone. There were footprints in the dust, small ones, dozens of them, and they were fresh. He grabbed his sidearm from the emergency kit, chambered around, and started moving. The canyon was narrow, walls rising high and jagged like broken glass pointing to the sun. The shadows were long, carved by centuries of wind. Every 20 steps he stopped, listening. At one point, he caught movement, just a blur, but fast. Someone small, watching him. Then came the voice, not English, not a language he recognized immediately, but the tone was unmistakable. Calm, curious, confident. He turned. A girl. Couldn't have been older than 10, standing barefoot at the edge of a rock shelf, her eyes locked on his. She didn't run. She didn't flinch. She just tilted her head slightly, as if appraising a wounded animal. Callum lowered his weapon. "I'm not here to hurt you." She said nothing, just turned and walked away. He followed. For 40 minutes they moved through the maze of stone deeper into the canyon. His ankle throbbed. His lungs burned. The sun crept higher, but he kept going. At some point, the path widened and he saw them. Dozens of figures huddled beneath the overhang of a natural stone arch. Women, children, some sleeping, some staring. A few carried jugs or bundles. They all looked the same, worn, weary, weightless, in a way that said they had long since let go of safety. The girl walked directly into their midst and sat beside a thin woman with sharp eyes and a heavy scar across her cheek. Callum stopped. The scarred woman stood walking toward him slowly. "You are the pilot," she said in English, her accent thick but precise. "I am," he said. "You flew alone into this place." "I did." She studied him. "Why?" "I had reason to believe people were being moved, without choice, without oversight." Her gaze didn't waver. "That's true. I wanted to see for myself. And now you've seen." He nodded. She motioned him to follow. They walked to a small depression in the canyon wall, a natural shelter now reinforced with old tarps and bent metal. Inside was a man tied to a post, his eyes swollen shut, lips cracked, hands raw from rope burns. "This man was part of the last transport," she said. "He was bringing food, but the crates were filled with sedatives." Callum knelt. The man looked barely conscious. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "You have a weapon. You have training. We have neither. And if I help, you leave with proof. Not stories, not rumors, but names, files, coordinates." "Where?" She pointed to the eastern slope. 2 kilometers beyond the ridge, an outpost underground, guarded but quiet during shift change. That's when they move supplies. "What's in it?" "Everything you need to break the silence." He thought about it, then nodded once. "I'll go." She said nothing more, just handed him a knife and 2 extra magazines. He moved out at dusk. The climb was slow. his ankle screaming with every shift in terrain. The air thinned as he rose, the sun painting long red strokes across the cliffs. He reached the crest just as the first stars blinked into view. Below, lights. Not bright, not enough to see from a satellite, but enough to mark entrances, 3 of them. 2 guards pacing in predictable loops. No drones, no towers, minimal tech. They weren't hiding from the world. They were hiding from the people who built them. He waited, watched, timed the rotation. At 1943, the west gate was momentarily unmanned. He slipped down the slope, low and fast, sliding into the shadows. The gate was an old blast door, reinforced but slightly ajar. Someone had grown lazy, complacent. He squeezed through, every breath tight. Inside, the hall was narrow and dim. Lights flickered. Somewhere far off, he heard the thrum of machinery. He moved in silence, following the cables that lined the ceiling. At a fork, he heard voices, laughter. The guards were distracted. He turned the opposite way, room after room, all empty. Then he found the server chamber. It wasn't large, 4 racks, 1 terminal, but it was live, running. He approached the console. The login was simple, a common contractor ID and a 4-digit PIN. Inside, files, thousands, labeled by operation date, some tagged with locations, others with code names. He found what he needed in less than 2 minutes. He loaded everything onto a drive. Then, before leaving, he opened the security footage folders. He didn't have time to watch it all, but he saw enough. Children drugged and tagged, men interrogated without masks, uniforms with no insignia, and 1 video. Dated 7 days ago, Azra, alive, tied to a chair, eyes defiant, spitting blood. His pulse spiked. He gripped the edge of the console and forced himself to breathe. She was alive, but not for long. He slipped out the way he came, the drive pressed to his chest, his steps faster now. The sky was black when he returned to the canyon. The camp had moved deeper, hidden again. But the scarred woman met him halfway. "I saw her," he said. The woman nodded. "We thought she was dead." "Not yet." "Then there's still time." He handed her the drive. "If I don't come back, give this to the people who can use it." She accepted it without question. He stood there a moment longer, looking at the shadows that moved like smoke between the canyon walls. Then he turned to go. Back to the fight, back into the storm. Because there was no jet now, no airstrike, no rescue team. Just a man with nothing left to lose, and a promise he hadn't finished keeping. The wind returned the moment Callum hit open air again, dry and merciless as ever. He had a plan, half-made, impulsive, stitched together from years of training and instinct. But there was one thing he knew with certainty. He was going to get her out. Back at the canyon, they'd told him where the compound moved prisoners for extraction, an airfield at the edge of a dried salt basin 40 clicks north, the same basin that once served as a test site during the Russian occupation, now converted into something quieter. Callum had heard rumors of it years before. No lights, no radar, no acknowledgement. But it was real. He moved with purpose, securing stolen supplies from the dead drop the scarred woman had buried years ago. Everything had been placed for a future no one expected to arrive. A thermal cloak, an outdated AK with a cracked stock, 2 knives, an old Soviet map, and a small paper tag that simply read, "For the pilot." He smiled grimly, shouldered the bag, and started north. He walked through the night, navigating the ridges by starlight. Every few hours he paused to sip water, scan the horizon, adjust his bearings. His ankle throbbed, but the pain sharpened his focus. By sunrise, he reached the crest overlooking the basin. He dropped flat on his stomach and peered down through binoculars stolen from the outpost. There it was. The basin wasn't just dry, it was buried, carved into the earth. What looked like a sand-swept flatland held within it a camouflaged tarmac, 2 hangars, and a control tower the height of a telephone pole. A single cargo plane sat on the runway, its engines idle. 2 trucks approached from the west, flanked by SUVs with armed guards. They were moving cargo, and he knew exactly what or who was in that convoy. He descended slowly, circling wide, using the wind-carved ridges to mask his approach. Every step had to be deliberate. The closer he got, the more the scent of fuel and rot reached his nose. He counted 15 guards, not military, not local, contractors just like before, foreign-trained, untraceable, hands without fingerprints. He crawled within 200 meters before stopping behind a dune, raised his binoculars again. The convoy stopped. 1 truck opened. Prisoners were let out, hooded, zip-tied. Some stumbled. Some resisted. 1 dropped to their knees and was kicked until they stood again. And then he saw her. 5th in the line. Asra, still standing, still breathing, her stride broken but her spine straight. Callum's vision narrowed. He marked the tower guard. Top of the control building, sniper rifle trained on the entrance. He marked the hangar doors, partially open, wide enough to hide something ugly. And then the timing clicked into place. 30 seconds between shifts on the far post, 20 for the tower to rotate. And if he moved, when the guards moved the prisoners, he could reach them. He pulled the thermal cloak from the pack, slung the AK over his back, and crawled forward, pressing into the shallow trough between 2 dunes. The wind picked up. Sand flurried around him. Visibility dropped to 20 feet. Perfect. He waited and waited. Then the shot rang out. One of the prisoners tried to run. A guard shouted, another shot. And in that chaos, Callum moved. He sprinted low and fast, straight into the blinding sand, weaving between shadows and steel. The guards didn't see him until it was too late. He hit the nearest one like a battering ram, slamming the man's head into the truck frame. The AK roared, short bursts, dropping 2 more before they turned. Azra dropped to the sand, rolling beneath the axle. Callum shouted, "Down!" A flashbang lit the sky. He fired again, clearing the path to the convoy. The wind howled louder now, a miniature storm swirling over the basin. A voice shouted into a radio, then cut off with a grunt. Callum reached Azra and sliced the zip tie from her wrists. Her eyes were wide, then focused. "You're late," she rasped. "You're welcome." They moved fast, grabbing keys from a fallen guard, unlocking the rear truck. 4 more prisoners, alive, confused. Callum shoved a pistol into one's hands. "Shoot anything that isn't us." He took the wheel. Azra climbed onto the roof with the rifle. "Ready?" he called. She didn't answer, just fired once. The tower guard fell. "Now," she said. They tore across the basin, engine roaring, bullets chewing the air behind them. A vehicle gave chase. 2, then 3. Azra kept firing. 1 truck spun out. Another flipped as it hit a hidden trench. The last stayed close, too close. Callum jerked the wheel, braked hard, and the pursuing vehicle rammed their tail. Azra nearly fell, caught herself, then dropped a flash grenade into their engine bay. A fireball lit the road, and then they were clear. They hid in an abandoned mineshaft 30 kilometers north. Callum reinforced the entrance with stone, covered the vehicle with a tarp. Inside they caught their breath. 4 prisoners, all of them scientists. 1 spoke English. "They were testing neurological inhibitors," the man said, "trying to erase traumatic memory on a chemical level. They called it Ember Protocol, but it didn't work. Just left people hollow." Azra stared at the cave wall. "And they'll do it again." Callum stood. "Not if we make it impossible." He activated the emergency sat ping from the stolen tower radio, then uploaded everything: photos, names, footage, the final proof, the file title, "Not Forgotten." The release exploded. Newsrooms picked it up immediately. Doctors confirmed the victims' identities. International courts opened proceedings. Dozens of resignations followed. Sanctions, raids, outrage. And through it all, whispers. The pilot, the canyon, the kite, a name returned to headlines. Reese. They didn't stay to see it, didn't watch the collapse, didn't attend the trials. They moved again, deep into the mountains. At night, Callum would sit by the fire, cleaning his weapon, while Asra boiled water and spoke in low tones with new allies. Refugees, journalists, dissidents, people who still believed in truth. One night, she handed him a worn journal. Inside, sketches of jets, diagrams, coordinates. On the last page, "We don't need permission to fly, just enough sky." He looked up. She smiled. And for the first time in years, he felt the altitude return. The snow returned in late spring, a final breath of winter brushing the peaks in silence. Callum stood on the outcrop just above their new shelter, more bunker than cabin, dug into the side of a forgotten ridge in the Caucasus Mountains. The wind was clean, the sky endless. He hadn't flown in nearly 6 months, not officially, but every morning, as the sun rose over the frosted caps, he felt the tug in his chest, the one that whispered of lift, of control surfaces catching air, of engines howling against gravity. And yet, for the first time in years, he wasn't running. Signal 9 had evolved. It wasn't just fugitives and whistleblowers anymore. It was a network of clarity, of guardians, a shadow infrastructure that didn't seek power, only accountability. Every few days, a new voice called in, sometimes scared, sometimes brave, always carrying a truth no one else would protect. Callum didn't need to lead anymore. Others were stepping up. People he'd never met who now told his story like it was myth. He let them. He wasn't interested in correcting legends, especially not the one they told most often, that he'd flown a stolen jet into enemy airspace to save one life, and by doing so, cracked open the belly of a machine that had devoured thousands. He hadn't saved one life. He'd simply refused to look away. Behind him, Asra stirred. She stepped into the light wearing a thick shawl, her breath fogging. "You're watching the sky again," she said. He smiled without turning. "Old habit." She stood beside him, hands tucked into her sleeves. "They're still saying your name." He shook his head. "Not my name, just the call sign." "They're the same thing now." He was quiet a moment, then he asked, "Do you think we'll ever stop?" "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I think we're allowed to rest." He nodded, looked out over the peaks. "Would you do it again?" she asked. "Fly into that canyon?" He didn't hesitate. "Every time." She reached out, took his hand, and the wind carried their silence higher. Not far from them, a radio blinked in the snow. A new message, coordinates, a voice they hadn't heard before. Callum didn't move, not yet. Instead, he closed his eyes and remembered the roar of the engine, the crackle of the headset, the narrowing of the canyon walls, the moment he stopped obeying and started choosing. Then he opened them again and whispered, "Let's fly."